Ladies and gentlemen, I am Harry Osiris, and this is my YouTube channel grecochess. And now we are going to start a new series. Recently, a number of great chess players have accepted my Facebook friendship request, and I asked them to share with me a game that they would like me to highlight. A few of them have responded, thanks to all that have responded, and I'm going to display them one by one, starting with the order that they replied to me. The first player that replied to me is Keith Arkell, who is a British Grandmaster, and it's a game that he played in Surrey in 1996 at the Easter International Open Championship, Chess Championship. At that time, Arkell had a rating of 25-25, and his opponent was Julian Hodgson. Julian Hodgson is also a British Grandmaster. At the time, his rating was 26-15, which meant that having 90 points more than Keith Arkell, Hodgson was the favorite, but we're going to see what happened. Just to tell you, Hodgson is still a great player with a rating of 2609, while Arkell is 2363, and among their successes. In 2008, Keith Arkell tied for first in the English Chess Championship. And also in 2014, he got second place, tying the first at the European Senior Chess Championship. Julia Hodgson was 4 times the winner of the British Chess Championship, 1991, 1992, 1999, and 2000. And the game took place in the year 1996 in Surrey. At that time, of course, there were no computers. In fact, there were computers, but they were not so strong as now. At that time, a Kasparov could still beat the computers. That is why the computer commentary you're going to see here from chess.com is something that the players did not have access not only during the game, but not even after the game. And I'm fortunate to be able to locate the notes of Keith Arkell, and we're going to read them as the game goes on. But first, let me share with you the board of chess.com. And Julia Hodgson had the white pieces, while Keith Arkell, my Facebook friend, had the black pieces. And let's see what happened in this game. By the way, you'll see the board. There's a difference with the previous videos. I changed the settings so you can see the files A through H here, and the rows 1 through 8. This is going to make it easier when I'm going to tell you that a piece goes from that square to that square. You'll be able to see it on the board. Myself, I'm used to that, but I don't think that all viewers are too familiar with this. So now you'll have this choice to understand much better what's happening. Once again, on the right, you're going to see the computer evaluation. Plus means white is advantage. In this case, it's Juliet Hodgson, while negative means that black is advantage, in this case, Keith Arkell. And let's see what happened. Julian starts by moving the pawn to d4, and Arkell replied, moving the pawn from e7 to e6. Standard opening theory until now. And Hodgson plays the pawn to d4, and Arkell moves the pawn to d5. This is very similar to the French opening, but with what's called interpolation, meaning the same moves but with different order, and we reach the same position with the French defense after 2 moves. And Julian moves his pawn to e5. This is the advanced French. And now Keith replies, the only move the theory move, pawn goes to c5, because otherwise white has a huge space advantage. Pawn goes to c3 to Keith, standard move. And next for Julian, pawn goes to c3, and for Keith, knight goes to c6. Still in theory. Let's see, when are we going to deviate? Julian places his knight on on f3, and you see the whole game until now. I'm going to explain it. Why do they play like that? It is for control of the square of d4. If one side can get control of it, and they can achieve a breakthrough, and they have a huge advantage. But theory is so well known that, especially at that level that they are playing, this is not likely to happen. Just to give a comparison, at the time of the game, Julia Hodgson had rating 2615, Keith Arkell had 2525. At that time, of course, in 1996, I had no rating. I had not even joined the US Chess Federation. But now, so many years later, my rating is still at 1582. So these players play way better than anything I can imagine. And Keith replies, sending his queen to b6. Everything until here is book move. You're going to see book move here. This is what the computer is saying. At some point, they're going to deviate. We already finished the first 5 moves. Julian places his pawn on a3. Of course, this is in order to, if there is any exchange of pawns, to avoid having a bishop going to b4 and checking. Again, book move. And now Keith is going to lock the position. Pawn goes to c4. Still in theory. And at this point, let's go and see what does Julian, excuse me, what does Keith have in his notes. Keith says the following. A player of Hodgson's caliber is of course strong in all types of positions, but I felt that avoidance of an open game was the best way to suppress his attacking skills. These are the notes from Keith Arkell. We are fortunate to have his notes from the game. Every few moves we're going to read from what he has said. Move number 7 now for Julian. Knight goes from b to d2. And Keith is going to reply by sending his knight on a5. And now we change a little bit from everything being the center towards the queen's part of the board. Now we go to the kings, because Julian will send his pawn to h4, trying to do some counterplay. We are not in theory any longer, but the computer says that h4 is the best. Let's see what Keith has in his notes. This position was new to me, but it seems that White's most common plans are 8-move pawn goes to g3, and then bishop goes to g2, and then castling, followed by unraveling his pieces, or direct action with 8-move rook goes to b1, and so on. We're fortunate to know that from here on, Keith was not in his comfort zone. This was something new to him, something that he didn't exactly expect. But Keith replies with sending his bishop to d7. Again, the best move against White has a very small advantage, the plus 0.32, just because he started first. Julian continues. Pawn goes to h5, which the computer thinks it's an inaccuracy. Would rather have the rook go to b1. And Keith replies with queenside castling. The best move, and finally Keith starts having, although a very small advantage, just 0.04. Pawn goes now to g3 for Julian, which will give some extra space for his bishop. And Keith sends his pawn from f7 to f5 to give some space there. Good for the computer, not the best. And Julian will take by what's called the en passant. I've had a video about the rules, but I believe most of you know the rules, that if I move my pawn by 2 squares and it lands next to my opponent's pawn, then the opponent has only just one opportunity at that moment to capture the pawn as if it had moved by only one square. This is called en passant. It's from French, meaning while passing. So pawn goes to f6, and let's read what Keith has in his notes. I was more worried about the slow build-up as I lacked space in which to maneuver. Pawn goes from g to f6. Keith will take back with the pawn. Of course, you cannot leave this pawn so near promotion. Bishop goes to h3 for white, and bishop goes to d6 for black. See that still white has not castled, and they are going to castle now. Julian will castle kingside. The problem for Julian, as the way I see it, the computer sees it in accuracy, is because you castle into empty space. Ideally, the pawn should be in front of the king, but here you see out of the three pawns, only the f pawns at f2, the g has made it to g3, the h at h5. For the time being, black has most of the pieces at the king side, but if they can transfer them to the black has them on the queen side to the left half that is, but if they can move them to the right half, the king side, the attack will be very strong. He tries to take more space by moving his pawn from e6 to e5, and Julian believes the best thing is to exchange the bishops. You see, little by little, black starts having a small advantage. And let's read now the thoughts of Keith at that point. White is quite short of options here and is pretty much reduced to playing for b3. This is the thought of Keith, meaning the black player at that point. Julian sends his rook at b1, opposite to the queen, and protecting the overprotecting, I would say, the pawn at b2. And Keith starts continuing attack, gaining more space for his bishop. Pawn goes to e4. This pawn not only attacks the knight at f3, that by itself doesn't mean too much because the knight will immediately move. At that level, players don't expect the opponents not to see these kind of attacks. But most important, there is an open diagonal for the bishop at d6. Before it couldn't go anywhere, now it can go. Still, it's going to be captured, but potentially it could take at g3. If there could be a rook, for example, here, something like that, it might be worthwhile to sacrifice your piece for 2 pawns, especially if these 2 pawns are in front of the king. At least you have this option and your opponent has to worry about whether you actually do it or not. Knight goes to h4, of course. Julian did not allow his knight to be captured. Knight goes to e7 for Keith. Not only developing the knight, but giving more space for the rook, and especially the option could go to the g5. Julian sends his pawn to b3. Hopefully, if the pawn can take at c4, then the rook attacks a queen. Of course, this most likely will not happen, but at least little by little, Julian's rook has more life, has more game. Queen goes to c7. Bishop goes to c4. Not bishop, pawn from b3 goes to c4 for Julian, and Keith will send his pawn on e3. You see that Julian has an extra pawn, and he's also perhaps going to lose a second one if Julian takes the pawn from f2 to e3. Yes, there's a temporary attack on the knight on e2, but of course this knight is going to move. Or if the top pawn on f2 takes e3, then the knight is not attacked any longer. Here we're going to read once again what did Keith think about that part. And takes to c4 with some advantage is probably the best here, but my move is the most interesting, he says. Let's see if the computer agrees with you. No, the computer does not agree with the comments, agrees with the game, with the way that Keith played, but does not agree with his comment that it would have been better to send the knight to c4. And as I mentioned before, this powerful computer that we have now did not exist in 1996. At the time, there were some computers, but they were very low level, meaning a Kasparov could easily beat them. It was before the time of Kasparov losing from Deep Blue. Of course, most players would not fight against the strongest computers even at that time, but at least the very strong grandmasters could have some chance. And let's see now how does Julian react. Yes, he takes the pawn on e3, and temporarily he's 2 pawns ahead, but the computer says that Black Keith has an advantage of 1.46, almost 1.5 pawns. And Keith now will take the pawn at h3. You see that the still Black is still 1 point behind, but look at how empty is White's king. Bishop at g3, attacks the knight at h4. That is not yet lost, but doesn't have too many places to go. The rook can easily go to g8. The queen can come down if necessary. A check can come from h2 perhaps. So really, White has to be careful about their king safety, which is a very important factor in chess. Knight goes to g2, gives some cover to the king. And of course, Keith will send his rook on g8. Expected, because White's king is not well covered. Little by little, we are building here the attack. This is after move 20. And let's see what Keith has to say at this point. I'm now committed to sacrificing at least a pawn, he says. Julian sends his queen at e2 to overprotect the knight on g2. We both found it very hard to analyze his position, Keith would say after the game. There are a number of possibilities, but nothing concrete to get a grip on. I decided that the e7 knight just gets in the way, so I started toying with imaginative ideas for sacrificing it. Meaning this knight, because if this knight was not here, rook and the queen would easily go on the g file and create a very strong attack. Knight goes to c6 is not sacrificed yet, but gets out of the way. Pawn mistakes is a computer. Would rather have the pawn go to f5 and continue the attack. And we see that the advantage of Black decreases from almost 1.5 pawn before. Now it is almost equal, just 0.29 advantage for Black. Pawn takes a d5. And the rook goes, and it's a miss. Pawn goes to g6 would be the best for White, because then actually the rook would not easily go to g5, would not go to g7, controlled by the pawn. Of course, Black could still be able somehow to control the g file. They could either sacrifice perhaps one of the rooks to put the queen there, or need an extra 2-3 moves to completely control the g file. And now, really, Keith will sacrifice his knight at c6. It's attacked, but he doesn't care. He would rather put his rook on g7. And the computer says it is brilliant. It's not very frequent that you see these 2 exclamation marks next to a move. Usually the computer will do it if you sacrifice a piece and play a move that is the best, but it's not easy to see that point. You're taking a big chance, because if the attack succeeds, great, but if it fails, Black would have to continue with 1 piece less and perhaps reach a losing ending. And while the computer says it's great, let's see what he thought about that point. This can't be objectively correct, but I think that in practice, even for a strong tactician like Julian, it isn't so easy to defend. Once again, the computer agrees with the way that Keith played, but does not agree with his comments. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts instead of your logic. Let's see how Julian will react. He's not going to take the knight. He realizes he is in big danger, so he said he's going to send his knight at f3, and by that way, he controls the h2 square, not black cannot make a check on h2 and then take the knight at g2, but computer thinks it's an inaccuracy and gives a huge advantage, almost 3 pawns to black to Keith. Now we're going to read the notes again. If he grabs a knight, play might go pawn from d goes to c6, check h2, king 1, rook takes g2, queen takes g2, rook takes g2, c takes b7 check, knight b7, king g2, and queen. And he basically, Keith is saying the whole analysis of the moves, if Julian would take the pawn, excuse me, would take the knight at c6 from move 23 until move 38 moves. So Keith was able to analyze 8 moves in his head before he played move 22 to see what would happen if Julian would take the knight, so that he realizes that he has very little to lose. He's not going to be worse if this sequence of move takes place. But in any case, Julian would not take the knight. And now let's see what did Keith do. He sent his queen to f7, attacks the pawn at h5, and if allowed, if the knight on f3 doesn't move, then the queen on h5 would be extremely dangerous. And let's see what Keith once again has to say about this move. I was quite pleased with this move at the time, again offering up the knight along with some pawns in order to bring my queen into the attack. It won me the game, but I eventually discovered that it wasn't the best move. I'll explain later, he says. Well, here the computer agrees with the analysis of Keith, not with his game. Now, Julian takes at c6, queen takes at h5. So we see that the computer thinks it's a great move, but I think it's obvious. If you're going to sacrifice your knight, you want to get something concrete. And I'm not talking about just a pawn, but all the attack on the G and H files. I don't think it was that difficult to guess it once you accepted the fact that you're going to lose your knight at c6. Computer thinks it's a great move, gives a small advantage to black. And let's see how we continue. Pawn takes at b7 for white. And you might expect the knight to take at b7, since white is already quite a lot of material ahead, at least black to minimize, but it's not going to happen. I'm going to explain why. Because if knight takes it, then queen can go to a6, for example, and create then the knight is pinned, attack the pawn at a7, suddenly white will have a very dangerous attack. But by sending the king at b8, you use white's pawn as a cover. Sometimes, if the pawn is one square for promotion, it is very useful, instead of taking it if you have a chance, to put the king behind it. So first of all, the pawn cannot promote, because if the king went, for example, to c7 or d78, then the pawn would automatically promote. But put just behind, so the pawn cannot promote, but white doesn't have such a strong attack. Rook goes to b2, helping both defend, attack and defense. Queen goes to h3. You see now that if the bishop on g3 could disappear, then the queen and the two rooks have a very powerful attack. Still, it's not completely winning, because you attack the knight at g2 with 3 pieces, queen and 2 rooks, and it's defended by 3 pieces, the king, the queen, and the rook. But it starts becoming dangerous. Pawn goes to e4 for white, which gives a little bit more space for the bishop. and rook goes to g4. And let's see what Keith has to say about this move. The exclamation mark, he places an exclamation mark in this move, is for the concept. The position remains extremely hard to analyze, but as with many true, quote-unquote, true sacrifices, a thorough investigation will probably demonstrate ways to defend successfully. So Keith believes that in practice, it's a very strong attack. In theory, meaning if one had infinite time to defend and perhaps a computer at the disposal, it's defendable. What does the computer say? The computer agrees with that. 0.00, that the position is equal. Pawn goes to e5. White wants to create some counterplay. Where is move number e5? This places a question mark, meaning mistake. Later on, I saw Julian analyzing the position with famed English master John Nunn. She called me over and asked, what would you have played against d5? If instead of e5 it was d5. f5, I replied. The dog's playing uh, bishop to e3 in that position, then what would you do? And we played the following variation. So they played the two of them after the game, a kind of variation with the assistance of John Nunn, who is also a very famous British grandmaster. And it's an interesting comment that you see, but to find out what is really going on after my 27 move, you need to ask a strong computer. And now let's see what does the strong computer say, the much stronger than they ever had. It says a blunder, and you see from 0.00 from equal position, now black has more than 2 pawns of advantage. But having an advantage, especially when you don't have the computer to tell you, it's not the same like winning the game. And let's see what did Keith do. First of all, he takes the pawn at e5. A great move for the computer, but too obvious, I would say. What else would you do? You definitely don't want this pawn to continue running and, if not promoting, at least distracting you from your own attack. D pawn at e5, knight goes to c4. You see here what's happening. If the queen takes the knight, the knight attacks a rook. If the queen takes the knight, then the bishop goes to h2 checks, and things become very difficult for black. They're going to lose the knight at g2. They might lose even their queen if white wants to minimize the damage. So white preferred, instead of taking the knight with the queen, let's see what would have happened if he took it. Then bishop goes to h2 check, knight takes to f2, rook goes to g2 check, rook takes, and it could be mate. This is why white saw the thing and they place the rook on c2. Rook goes to a mistake for black. Excuse me, a mistake for white. Julius, they say now it's a really mistake. They would rather have the queen go to d3. Somehow white might survive. They say mate in 3. And now, let's see. Is there a mate in 3 moves, and did Keith see it? Keith places, you look on h4, and you see the threat. Brilliance as a computer. Because, yes, any of the knights can take the rook. There is a threat of mate. If you do nothing, queen goes to h1, it's mate. The knight at g will take the rook. Why not the knight at f? Because if the knight at f takes it, then queen to h2 should be made. That is why white uses his knight from g2 to take at h4. And bishop now goes to f2, and this is what is called a double check. Double because both the rook and the bishop are checking the king, so such double checks can never be covered. And you cannot take the piece because you can at most take one of the two pieces, so the other is still checking you. So the only thing you can do is move your king. And where move the king? How many squares does the king have to move? Nope. No f1, not h1, no g2, not h2, and the only one thing that remains is take the bishop at f2. But now, I think you can see it. Keith places his queen on g3 and checkmates Julia Hodgson in 32 moves. It's an amazing accomplishment. You play with black, with someone that is 90 points above you, someone that has won 4 times totally, but since the game was 1996, twice before that has won the British Championship. And you checkmate them in 32 moves. This is an amazing accomplishment for Keith. But let's see what does the computer have to say. Let's see the computer review. The computer thinks that Keith Arkell played with an accuracy of 89.7 versus 76.6 for Julian. And both played less than their ratings at the time. From 2525, Keith goes down to 2400. Julia from 1615 goes down even more to 1850. And Keith Arkell had three brilliant moves. 3 versus 1 great moves for Keith, 10 versus 9 best for Julian, 2 versus 1 best for, actually excellent for Keith. Both of them had 3 good moves and both of them had 7 book moves. If the game lasted 32 moves, the first 7 were from theory. And let's go to the negative category. Julian had 4 inaccuracies versus 1 for Keith, 4 mistakes for Julian versus 2 for Keith. Both had 1 miss, and it seems that Keith had 1 blunder. That is what today's computers have to say, which are much, much more powerful than any computer they had at the time. For Keith, first of all, congratulations for your win, but most of all, thank you very much for sharing with me this game and also leading me to this file that had your thoughts at the time. And let's read a little bit more about Keith's thought after the game. He says, quote unquote, I do believe that's Major Julian after spotting the play out to the end. As an appendix, a few days later, I was demonstrating the game to leading English female player Harriet Hunt, asking her to guess my moves. When we arrived at my 23rd, Harriet suggested queen to d7 instead of f7. Nearly responded, putting it back on c7. Try again. But she insisted on 23rd move queen to d7, urging me to get it as near his king as you can, while pawning to h3. Finally got it. My queen arrives on the important h3 square in 2 moves rather than 3, and successful defense will be much harder to find. And let's see what happened on move number 23 that they made this comment. We'll place it at 23 here. Yes, what Harriet Hunt wanted is to see the queen not going to f7, but going to d7, because then it could much easier arrive to h7 and not having first to take the pawn at h5 just because Juliet took the knight. This is post-mortem, as it's called, comment. Once again, congratulations to Keith Arkell for his win, and of course, congratulations for his overall career as one of the greatest British chess players. And thanks, Keith, although we don't know each other personally, he replied to my message and shared this game with me. I was very happy to show it to you. We're going to continue with most games from my Facebook Grandmaster friends. Thanks for watching, ladies and gentlemen. I am Harry Lasaniziris. This is my Greco Chess YouTube channel. Time to say goodbye.